All right, good. All right, we're rolling. Okay, welcome back. Part 2 of the self and perceptual module. This is video 2, and it is titled, what did I name it? Self. You, yourself, and yours. So it's like me, myself, and I. You, yourself, and yours. So this is all about your construction of self, because what we talked about before is perception and kind of all these processes that happen in between you and the world that keep you from sort of perceiving the world, quote, as it is, if such a thing were even possible. So you have to choose how you want to see the world, right? Because your default setting is usually kind of negative. Now we're going to talk about how those perception processes also yield your sense of who you are. Because even though as like a little baby, before you have a sense of yourself, it's the world around you kind of float. You're like floating through the world. So you start to develop these perceptions of different things. And then as you make perceptions and start to organize information, you start to build a self. You're now at the point where the self has started to feel like you, but it's not really you. You have multiple selves. You have competing versions of yourself. You have future, past, present self. You have optimistic, explanatory versus pessimistic self. I mean, you have so many selves that it's almost impossible to say who you are. Who you are is kind of just the provisional quilting point of a bunch of contradictions. There's no like you, so to speak. There's just you, yourself, and yours, right? And so, but what you do though is as you're making decisions, how to relate to people, who to relate to, who to trust, who to disclose to, all this stuff, yourself, right, this thing you think is yourself drives a lot of what you think. And if you have a very weak sense of self-concept, you're going to make decisions from a bad place. You always, this is going to sound so fucking dorky, but you always really want to make decisions from a place of self-acceptance, if not self-love. In an ideal world, you would love yourself and you would make decisions from a place of self-love. But at the very least, you want to make decisions from a place of self-acceptance, meaning you're confident and comfortable in who you are. You don't apologize to people for who you are. That doesn't mean you don't want to improve. It just means like you're solid in your self-identity. And then you make the decision, not I feel threatened, I feel attacked, you don't talk to me that way, I'm a piece of shit. And then you make the decision, right? You do not want to make decisions and interact with people from a place of self-loathing, self-aggrandizement, overcompensation, any of that stuff. So that's a lot of what this unit is going to be about. All right, so first of all, let's talk about all of your different selves. These are called your self-constructs, and they're all the different components of sort of what makes you, you. And I'm not talking here about like your personality islands from Inside Out or whatever. I'm talking about like sort of these more metaphysical selves. So first you have your self-esteem. Your self-esteem is probably, to me, the least useful, but it's the one that we use the most often. And it's just a general, it's not a specific, it's just a general feeling of self-worth and self-value. And it's generality, right? The fact that self-esteem is just kind of sort of generally how you feel about yourself, whether you're a good person, whether you like yourself. The fact it's so general is part of what makes it kind of a weak area to target for self-improvement. So generally speaking, I don't talk much about self-esteem, your feelings of self-worth or value, because they are kind of very amorphous and general. But as you improve other self-constructs, you'll start to feel your overall self-esteem get a little bit better. So it's not to say your self-esteem is not important. It's just to say that if we're going to target an area for improvement, we're not going to start with self-esteem because it's too general. So then we have this other self-construct, which is your self-concept. Self-esteem is your general feelings of self-worth and self-value. They're very general. Self-concept is a very specific belief about the nature and organization of your identity. Self-concepts are multidimensional. So you're going to have different self-concepts for different domains of your life. So your self-concept or your set of self-concepts is kind of just like what you believe you are and what you stand for. So early in development, children tend to have sort of a vague general concept of themselves because like at a certain point, like you're just everyone around you. You don't have a sense of like your own self, right? You're just kind of this blob that floats around on the earth. And then eventually you start to recognize you're different from the people around you, like physically you're different, and then you start to realize that you kind of are separate as an entity. Now, in an ideal world, you would gradually diversify into your own selves, and you would see yourself like as a student, as in relation to your peers, in relation to your family, your emotional, your physical self-concept, right? You would have distinct self-concepts. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not interdependent on other people, meaning that doesn't mean that you don't kind of have a give and take where if your parent or your family member tells you that they wish you would do more of X or that you would be more like X, that you don't take that shit into consideration. It just means that you're not running around the earth just waiting to be molded into something to match other people's expectations, right? You're what we call self-differentiation. You're differentiated from the people around you. It's unclear whether self-concepts are formed top-down, so people think certain things that are like specific and then you kind of come to think of them about yourself, or whether you create the beliefs and then they flow upward. Don't worry about cause and effect. Cause and effect is so useless in interpersonal communication. Like, that's the whole punctuation thing. I mean, we can make it up if it's helpful, but it's not real. However, for many of us, especially if we're raised in like codependent, dysfunctional households, you don't develop a clear sense of self and distinction from your family of origin. It's called poor differentiation, right? You have a hard time telling where your boundaries end and where other people's boundaries begin. And that is bad. But it also happens all the time. So if you grew up in a family of origin that said things like, you hurt my feelings, or did so-and-so hurt your feelings, or you're making your grandma blank, or you shouldn't do that because grandma's going to feel blank, you are likely to have a poor sense of self-differentiation, right? You have a hard time deciding where your boundaries end and where other people's boundaries begin. That is unfortunately more often the case than not. So if that's the case, you're not going to have a very strong self-concept because you don't have any psychic space away from your family of origin to figure out who the fuck you are and what you like and what you want and what you don't like and you don't want, right? And then also what happens is that this kind of carries over. So now you're living in a dorm in college, or you're in a house with roommates, or you have a partner, or you have your own kids. And since you've never learned how to self-differentiate and create self-concepts, you now just become the concept that fits them, and you don't kind of have your own sense of concept. And so if you've ever seen a movie where somebody like abruptly leaves their family to quote unquote go find themselves, that is the result of poor differentiation early on and getting into relationships with other people where you can't tell where the boundaries are between you and them, right? If your partner gets upset, you can't turn off your phone because you're afraid of how they're going to behave, right? That's the stuff that makes for poor self-differentiation. That's my notification. I got to finish this video and go to yoga. Okay. So that's a bad self-concept. You need self-concepts. You need clear senses of like, I am this person. So self-concepts are like, I am a runner. I am a musician. I am a conservative. I don't spend time with people who don't appreciate me. I am artsy. I like creative things. I like to work with my hands. I mean, they're typically like I am statements. They might also be I like, I tolerate, I don't like, I don't tolerate, I believe, I don't believe, right? They're those kinds of statements. I mean, they carve out your identity distinct from other people. So statements that are not self-concepts are whatever you want to do. I don't know. Sometimes I'm this. It depends on the situation. Those are not self-concepts. I mean, that is you kind of being like a big jelly blob with no clear sense of your boundaries. And of course, having a strong self-concept disappoints people because if they want to do X, Y, and Z and you're like, yeah, I'm not a hiker. Like, I'm not a hiker. Sorry. Y'all want to go hiking? Go hiking. I don't do hiking. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't go hiking. I'm not an asshole. So if somebody like really is like, no, it's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. I might give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, this is that schemata thing. I don't want to like stereotype hiking, but I'll get there. And if I don't like it, I'm going to be like, nope, I'm dipping. Like, I'm done. And I don't care. It's my self-concept. I'm good. I feel good about this. And the key here is you can't feel bad about your self-concept. If your self-concept makes you feel bad, you need to think about revising your self-concept or getting a stronger backbone. So there are a couple of concepts, self-concepts that many of you have developed that are bad self-concepts. They are procrastinator, perfectionist, and people pleaser. Okay, they're not real. Like all self-concepts, right? These are made up. And because they're made up, you have to ask yourself, does thinking like this about myself help me? Yes and no. Like, yeah, you have this label, right? Oh, I'm a procrastinator. I'm a people pleaser. And the label helps you make sense of these behaviors that you don't want to have but are hard to change. So then you can be like, oh, well, this is just who I am, right? So you don't have to do the work of fixing it. But the label's also not helpful because you have this label and it helps you make sense of the behaviors that you don't want and are hard to change. So you are holding onto a label that maybe doesn't serve you. And I've never met a person in the whole world who says I'm a procrastinator, I'm a perfectionist, and I'm a people pleaser, and it seems like a good move for them. So these are self-concept. These are examples of self-concept. I am, and then a very specific statement about an activity that you are committed to or a behavior that you're committed to. But in this case, you've chosen self-concepts because they are convenient and they keep you comfortable, and you don't have to make changes that are hard, even though they would ultimately be better for you. So no one's a procrastinator, no one's a people pleaser, and no one is a perfectionist. And if you have one of these labels, this is a great thing to talk about during your voluntary coaching session, about where this label tends to flare up for you and why we might want to look at different labels and what those alternatives might be. Okay, so we got our self-esteem, which is generalized and not super useful. It's kind of just an overall feeling. And then we have self-concept. Then we have this concept of self-acceptance. Self-acceptance is the degree to which you're okay with your self-concept. So unlike self-esteem, which is kind of a general sense of self-worth or self-value, self-acceptance is specific to your concept and is likewise multidimensional. And self-acceptance of your self-concept in one area doesn't necessarily translate into general self-acceptance. So you don't really have generalized self-acceptance. You have specific self-acceptance related to certain constructs. So for example, I am a person who just like, even though it has huge flaws, like believe in the state education system, and I accept that self-concept, so I feel good about it. And when people challenge me about how like, well, isn't it just a corrupt money-making system, and aren't you just like putting these students into debt for nothing? I feel good about the fact that I can have that conversation without feeling threatened, because I feel secure in my self-concept. It doesn't mean I'm perfect. It's just I feel secure. A self-concept that I have a self-concept that I'm not organized. I'm a disorganized, chaotic, running late, frazzled person. And it's become so much part of my identity that now, like, even being on time feels like somehow I'm selling out. Like, it's just like way less punk rock to be on time for shit, which is so stupid. So that's a place where I don't necessarily accept my self-concept. So I have like weird dissociation there, and it makes me uncomfortable. And that means when someone threatens my organization, I'm either going to be like, you're right, I'm the worst, or I'm going to get defensive because I already know it's a problem and I don't need to be nagged about it. So that's a place where I don't have a lot of self-acceptance around that self-concept. And so the solution there is either change the self-concept to I am disorganized, or change the self-concept to I'm organized so that I can accept it, or just accept that I'm disorganized and stop fussing about it. So that's a place where I struggle with my self-acceptance. All right. A place where I do not struggle is self-efficacy. EFFICACY. Self-efficacy is a belief in your capacity to succeed at tasks, right? It's your can-do-ness, your ability to get shit done, your ability to solve problems, your ability to figure stuff out. General self-efficacy is belief in your general capacity. So like for example, it's related to your self-concept. I am a problem solver is a self-concept thing that's also related to self-efficacy. I will never ask you on a quiz, given the example, I am a problem solver, is that self-efficacy or a self-concept? Because that's one of those examples it's impossible to tell the difference, right? Because it could be both. Specific self-efficacy refers to your belief about your ability to perform specific tasks, driving, public speaking, studying, or whatever. Self-efficacy is different from self-esteem because you can feel like you have a lot of worth or value and not feel like you're very good at doing things. It can be hard to distinguish. It's also likely that you might be in a situation where you have a lot of self-efficacy, so you can get a lot of stuff done, but you don't have a lot of self-worth. You don't think you deserve good things or good treatment. And if you are loved or appreciated, you have to earn it. And you feel like if you didn't get good grades or work hard or not be a bother to anybody, people wouldn't love you anymore. So you have to distinguish self-esteem or general feelings of self-worth from self-efficacy. Because a lot of times what will happen is that, like if you're in a family, for example, where you are expected to kind of be the example, you might have felt like you had to earn affection. And even now as an adult, you're still like earning affection, right? You have to prove that you're worth stuff. So you have great self-efficacy, you're a problem solver, but you have really low self-worth because if you weren't out solving people's problems, you wouldn't feel good about yourself. Then the opposite is true, although it's much rarer, I think, is that like, oh, I feel entitled to good treatment and I feel entitled to be given stuff, but I'm like not a problem solver. And so when you think of like the world's most spoiled brat, like if you think of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a character from Gossip Girl who's just so spoiled. I love that show, but there are just a lot of them. This is a person who's like, I have so much self-esteem. I love myself. I have so much self-worth, but I don't have to do that. I don't know how to do that. I'm not going to learn how to do that. It happens so rarely because I don't think you can have a lot of general self-esteem if you like can't solve problems, but it does happen. And that's like the worst kind of human being. The majority of us are not like that. But if you were raised by parents who just doted on you constantly and made you feel so good about yourself, but just constantly took care of your problems, I suppose that this could happen to you. but very few people are. But there is very often a situation where somebody will have a lot of self-efficacy, but not a lot of self-esteem. And that means if you're not solving people's problems, these are people pleasers, you don't feel like you have any value. You got to work on that because you want to have high self-efficacy, but you also want to have high self-esteem. And you want to be solving problems because it feels good. You don't want to be solving problems because it makes people like you. That's bad, right? So there's this saying about alcohol, like don't drink to feel better, drink to feel even better. Don't problem solve to feel better, problem solve to feel even better, right? It's the same kind of principle. You don't want to be problem solving from a place of self-loathing. You want to be problem solving from a place of self-acceptance. Like, I don't have to solve this problem to prove I'm worth anything, but I'm going to solve it because I think it's the right thing to do and I would enjoy it, right? That's the difference. Okay, and then of course, last but not least, we have this thing called self-confidence. Confidence is belief in your personal worth and likelihood of succeeding. So if you're high on self-efficacy and you're high on self-esteem, you have high self-confidence. So, and self-confidence is different than confidence. I know lots of people who I wouldn't call like confident that have self-confidence because they know that they're worthy of good treatment and they know that they can solve their problems. Like if life gives them lemons, they'll make lemonade. That's self-confidence. That doesn't necessarily mean that they go out and strut their confidence. It just means they're coming from a place of strong self-acceptance of their concepts, right? So they accept their self-concepts and they're working on the ones that maybe they don't accept, but they're not beating themselves up out of it. And they also know that they can problem solve and they have high self-worth. So all of that leads to self-confidence. And self-confidence is, of course, what I want for you. But it's hard to come by and it takes a lot of work. And it's one of the things we are going to kind of work on a little bit in this class. All right. So how do you know, right? Like where do your standards for self-concept come from? How do you know what your concepts are? Where do you get self-esteem? I mean, all these selves that you have, where do they come from? So according to the theory of self-discrepancy, the self-discrepancy theory states that people compare themselves to internalized standards called self-guides. These different representations of the self can be contradictory and result in emotional discomfort. Self-discrepancy is the gap between two of these self-representations. So essentially, you have three, what I call like voices in your head, right? There are three domains of self. So when you think about, for example, what's my self-concept, what's my self-esteem, the answer to that is going to come from three different places in your mind. You have what we call the actual self. You have the ought self, which is the should self. And then you have the ideal self. So for example, if you're sitting on the couch and you know you should do X, right? You should study, you should do laundry. But you're watching TV and you kind of like the show and you really just don't want to get up off the couch. You're going to have one voice in your head that's like nagging you, right? You should get up. You need to do this. You ought to do this. And it's usually kind of punitive. The ought voice is all about punishment, right? So either giving you punishment or taking punishment away. So you ought to do this because we need to avoid bad grades, right? It's not like a good feeling. It's like it's running away. So in psychology, we call this the push motivation. It's the motivation to do something because you're trying to get away from being eaten by the tiger, as opposed to pull motivation, which is running toward flowers, right? So running toward flowers, you could not run toward the flowers and nothing bad would happen to you. But if you don't run away from the tiger, something bad will happen to you, right? So the ought self is all about punishment, right? We want to avoid punishment. So you better do the stuff. You're going to get bad grades. Life's going to suck, right? It's the use of punishment. The ideal self is like this higher, like, oh, no, honey, you should do this. You get to do this. This is going to be so, right? It's very reward focused. It's very like positive outcomes. And most of us have a really hard time hearing our ideal self. Our ideal self is like off somewhere in the future where they're rich and hot and happy and successful, but they're so far away from us because we don't practice a lot hanging out with our ideal self. We spend a lot of time hanging out with our should self. And then in the middle is you, caught between your ideal self that like wants all these great things, but kind of like haunted by your ought self, that your should self, which is like constantly reminding you of all the pressure and all of the damage. And then there's you, who is just kind of existing, sort of caught between these two, and most of the time just avoiding. So what winds up happening is you got the should self over here on the one, and you got the ideal self over here on the other. And yeah, this all sounds nice, but it's so far away and it's so hard and I'm never going to be able to get there. And then it's like, but punishment, but punishment, but punishment. And you're like, yeah, but it's not immediate. So I'm going to ignore you too. And then here's my actual self, who's just kind of zoned out, kind of like buffering, right? Scrolling social media, watching TV, drinking, sleeping. I mean, whatever kind of keeps you out of this fucking dysfunctional debate going on in your head. So again, your actual is like all your collection of self-concepts and you're feeling about those self-concepts. It's such a nebulous, weird, but it's the shit you're doing now. So if you say you're a rock climber and you haven't been rock climbing in 6 months, I don't know that I would say your actual self is a rock climber. But if you went rock climbing last week and you got plans to go next week and you're probably going to follow through, you're a rock climber, right? So that's your actual self. So your ought self is your representation of the attributes that someone, could be you or another person, it's really hard to say like where this stuff comes from, believes you should or ought to possess. It's the representation of someone else's sense of your duty, obligations, or responsibility. The ought self-regulatory system focuses on the presence or absence of negative outcomes, like criticism, right? So it's the tiger voice when you're running away from the tiger. It's usually concerned with your safety and security. So your ought voice is never like, you should go draw your art because it'll make you feel so much better. I mean, your should voice doesn't kind of do that. Your should voice is much more like, you should do your art because if you don't, this is going to happen and your parents are never going to take you seriously. And it's all about like, you should do this to avoid negative consequences. And if you don't do it, you're going to get these negative consequences. The ideal self could also be nagging you to do your art, but it would be for like much more delightful, lovely reasons, like makes you feel good and you have all this self-expression. And the problem a lot of us make is when we're trying to get ourselves to do shit, we tune into our ought voice. And sometimes it's like a literal voice. I mean, if you have a parent or a family member or somebody or a roommate who's nagging you all the time to do your stuff, you have a literal ought voice in your head, right? So we pay so much attention to that voice that we wind up drowning out the ideal voice because we're resentful and angry, and then our actual self is to do nothing. So for example, I am a writer. That is a self-concept. My self-efficacy is a little low on that because I'm not sure that I can get the publications out that I want to get out because frankly it's very hard, and I have had some success, but it's just one of those things where I doubt myself. And I have this ought voice that's like, you should do stuff because if not, negative consequence, negative consequence, negative consequence. And then very quietly I have this, but writing feels good and you're smart and you should do it. But it's so quiet. And then my actual self is just kind of like, this is exhausting. I'm going to spend more time editing the homepage on my Canvas page because at least it's something, right? It's not like watching TV, although I do a fair amount of that too. When grading time comes around, that's when I have nothing left. I have so much ought voice and no ideal voice, and so that's when I really like to avoid. Okay, so you also have like, where are the voices coming from? Where is the ideal self versus the ought self? And it's sometimes you and sometimes it's others, and there's no real way to tell the difference. You kind of just have to label them. Like, is this your own ideal self, or is this someone else's ideal self for you? Is this your own ought self, or is this somebody else's ought self for you? And then sometimes you imagine it. Like, there are all these like movies where the like son thinks that the dad always wanted him to be a basketball player, but he really wants to be a musician. So his ideal self is musician, but his dad's is the basketball player. And then one day he's finally like, Dad, I don't want to be a basketball player. And the dad's like, I just want you to be happy. So this whole time, the other ought self that was in his head was really just an imagined thing. So this is important because first of all, you have to ask, like, is this ought or ideal self mine or someone else's? And if it's someone else's, is it really theirs, or am I making it up? And also, if it is really theirs, why do I give a shit? Like, why do I care that everyone in my family thinks that I should be a banker? And why do I care that the rest of the world would love it if I were a size 10? Like, why do I care? And part of that too is we never really stop, I don't think, to say like, I don't like believe the shit that's coming out of my ought self's mouth. So those are your standpoints of self. They're your vantage points, your standpoints in which the self is perceived. It's the point of view from which you can judge and be judged about your attitudes and values. So there's the yours, the ours, our own self, and then there's the others. Studies, this I found very interesting. So speaking of procrastination, studies have correlated the theory of self-discrepancy that I just described and procrastination. Specifically, when you have discrepancies in the actual and ought domain from your own perspective, you will procrastinate. Meaning, if your actual self is sitting here drinking beer and your ought self, your own ought self, ought to be studying for your final exam, that's when you'll procrastinate the most. And that makes sense, right? Because if it's like your family nagging you to do something, you don't feel as committed to it. So you might procrastinate, but it's when your own alignment between what you're actually doing and what you really think you should be doing, when that's not vibing, that's when you really, really want to procrastinate, because it's so stressful to you that where you are and what you should be doing are so far apart. And avoidance, of course, here is the common theme. The actual ought self-regulatory system responds through avoidance. Procrastinators also have an avoidance relationship with goals, and I'm sure that makes sense. So that thing you call procrastination is the avoidance response when your actual and ought domains are not matching up. All right, that's what procrastination is. It's not a self-concept. You are not a procrastinator. Everyone procrastinates when their actual and ought domains don't line up. All right, so the question is, do you want to keep avoiding with your actual and ought domains, or do you want to fix your domains and stop procrastinating, right? Those are your two choices, but you are not a procrastinator. It's not some kind of like diagnosis that a doctor gave you that you need meds for, right? Procrastination is not a diagnosis. It is just the name of a certain set of avoidance behaviors that everyone participates in when their ought and ideal selves don't match up. All right. And then this is, I think, almost the end of it. Yep, we're really close. All right. We have an overall feeling that we are not obtaining our desires and hopes, right? So when we have this overall feeling that we are not meeting our own ideals, we tend to feel disappointment, dissatisfaction, and frustration. So when our actual behavior, like me, the beer drinking homework avoider, imagines this beautiful life in which I'm just like this successful business person who's sober and just like always whatever, I don't know, whatever your ideal self is. That is the actual versus own ideals. And when we have a discrepancy between our actual and own ideals, we tend to feel a lot of disappointment, dissatisfaction, and frustration. To me, actual versus own ideals is a great problem to have. It's much better than the actual versus ought, which is why your feeling is disappointment and not like dread. When you have an overall feeling that you're not obtaining others' desires and hopes, that's your actual versus others' ideals. So there's your actual self, what's actually going on with you, versus what other people think you should be doing. You feel shame. So if your whole family is like full of lawyers and they all think you'd be so happy as a lawyer, man, being a lawyer is the coolest. And remember, this is your ideal self. So this is the aspirational self. It's the self of like reward. Oh, you're gonna make so much money. You'd be able to hang out with the fam. We'd all be able to take law vacations together or whatever. And your actual self just like isn't into law. You're going to kind of feel shame and embarrassment because you sort of feel socially like inept. When you have an overall feeling that you are not meeting what others see as our duties and obligations, right? That's your ought self. So others' ought self, that makes you feel like agitated and fear of punishment. So this one can be really bad because you have other people who are like, you're going to be punished and this is bad. Like you might even imagine my voice, like if you don't get your paper in, bad stuff's going to happen to you, but you're not doing the thing that would accomplish that goal. That's where you start to feel a lot of fear, a lot of dread. So that is the actual versus others ought. And then, of course, you have your actual versus own ought. So I should be doing this. And sometimes it can be things like really seriously, like I should stand up for this person at this party who clearly just got roofied, but I'm not because it's my friend and it's their house and I don't want, right? That is like a really kind of like a deep sense of just like internal dissonance. Because you aren't upholding the things that you believe in, and that can make you feel very, I don't know what the word is for that, but it's really tough. I mean, one of the hardest things I think is when you have like a very strong sense of duty or obligation that you've internalized, it's yours, it's not someone else's, and then you don't meet that thing. So that one can create a really strong sense of discrepancy. But again, there are other things that happen with these other domains, but procrastination primarily is the one I think that affects most of you the most. And so that is when you have your actual self and then what you think you ought to be doing. So it's your actual versus your own ought. And that is that like falling short of your own sense of like moral standards where you're not doing the thing that you know you should be doing. That's what creates those feelings of like the need to avoid, because it's just so fundamentally like I am not here for myself. I am not keeping promises to myself. I am not showing up for myself. I'm not doing the things that I know I want and should be doing. That sense of misalignment and discrepancy is so strong. It's no wonder that people procrastinate and do anything they can not to have to face up to it. Speaking of which, right now, I'm supposed to be at yoga because it's 6:16 and yoga starts at 6:30. There's no way I'm going to make it home and get to yoga in 14 minutes. So currently my actual behavior, which is me teaching, right, is conflicting with my ought behavior, which is, well, and my ideal behavior, which is me going to yoga, because going to my yoga classes is both something I ought to do because it avoids physical pain and gaining weight and feeling lethargic and all these other things. But it also is an ideal because like it also provides a lot of reward. I feel good. I like the way it makes me look. Like I like the movements. I like listening to music, right? So I feel a lot of discrepancy, and I'm bummed out, and I feel very shitty that I didn't follow through and didn't show up for myself because this was on my calendar. But then I remember I also have my actual self who is here doing my teaching, making these badass videos. Well, I don't know if they're badass, but they're certainly a shit ton better than the readings I used to have you do. And so I have to also remember that even though I might not be meeting my own ought and ideal goals at the moment in the yoga self-concept domain, I am meeting them in the teacher domain. And so part of this is managing your mind around this, because what I don't want to do is get done with this video, have missed yoga, and then say fuck it to the rest of my night because I have this self-discrepancy moment. I want to make sense of it, figure out what I could have done differently, and then pick myself back up, right? This is why we like to know what self-discrepancy is. This is why it's important to understand that you have different self-domains. This is why it's important to understand your different self-constructs. And it's important to understand all of the different standpoints that you're looking at, because you have to first assess like what is going on here. Why am I feeling this like need to avoid? Why am I feeling this sort of out of alignment, misalignment with myself? What are the different standpoints? What are the self-concepts affected? What are the domains affected? And then how can I bring those into alignment? And in this case, instead of thinking about this from one self-concept, which is my yoga self-concept, I think of it from my teacher self-concept. And then it's like, well, you know what? I accept that. I accept that I chose to be a good teacher today instead of choosing to be a good yogi. I'm going to make peace with that because I want to make the rest of my decisions for the night from a place of self-acceptance and not from a place of self-loathing. And last but not least for our video, we have, so I don't really teach friendship communication, but this theory actually comes from the unit on friendship communication, but I put it over here in the self because part of the problem that a lot of us have is we have these self-concepts and we are afraid to ask people to validate them, because a lot of people want to validate the self-concept that they wish we had. So when we do things that they like or that's fun, or when we hang out in ways that they enjoy, they validate that self-concept. But then we have these other self-concepts that don't get validated, and then we hate that because we really like those self-concepts, but nobody's positively reinforcing them. So the name of this theory about this whole self-concept reinforcement is called Perceived Valued Social Identity. So PVSI, Perceived Valued Social Identity. And essentially, this theory states that all of us have these self-concepts. And the self-concepts that we sort of like want to project the most, right, those are our social identities. So certain self-concepts that are really important to us get elevated to the level of our social identity. So these are the self-concepts that we put out into the world for whatever reason. And part of it is you want to make sure that the self-concepts that are most important to you, you're putting out into the world. Because if, you know, you're really like somebody who loves art and reading and reflection and introspection and time to yourself and quiet, and you keep putting out this social identity that you're a party person, that's going to mess you up. But let's suppose that the social identity that you want to put out into the world, that you've chosen from all your self-concepts, let's suppose that the social identity that you want to put out into the world is that you are, and again, it's not like a hobby. It's not like I'm an MMA fighter or I'm a rock climber. It needs to be something more fundamental than that. But like you are laid back. That's a great one. So my self-concept is that I'm a laid-back person, right? That's how I identify. I'm good with that. I've accepted it, and it's really important to me, so I'm going to put that out there. That's my valued social identity. It's the most important thing about me that I want you to know. And if you don't know what your valued social identity are, and everyone's going to have a couple, but if you don't have a couple, you need to get a couple, right? That's part of your self-concept, is not only having tons and tons of self-concepts, but also knowing which of those self-concepts are your most important valued social identity. Now, here's the thing. What if, in fact, you're not really that laid back, right? You're kind of uptight. People are like, oh, where do you want to go to dinner? And you're like, oh, wherever. And then it's always you get there and you're like, really? This? if you're a friend to someone like that, the theory of perceived valued social identity states that we are going to value people in our life most who confirm and reinforce our valued social identity. What that means is that if you have a friend who's super type A and like really like perfectionist and has to have everything exactly the way they want it, but they believe that they're all laid back and that's how they like to think of themselves. That's their perception, right? They perceive themselves as laid back, even though you don't perceive them that way. Your friendship is going to have a very hard time if every time that person is like, oh, we can eat wherever, I'm super laid back, you say, no, you're not. You have more preferences than anybody I've ever met in the entire world. You just need to pick dinner, because if you don't pick dinner, you're going to be pissed wherever we go. That person is going to then reject because you're not validating their perceived valued social identity. That's called social identity support. So when we show social identity support, it's us showing up for people and saying, you know what, if this is the social identity that you want, I'm here for it. It's hard too, especially if like you had a friend from high school who you're really close to and they've changed, or you have a family member who's changed, and like, oh gosh, that movie's too old for you, shit. I was going to mention that movie with Julia Stiles where they dance. I'm trying to think of a newer movie, but well, anyway, and I'll just use that example. In that movie, the like rough and tough kids. Oh, On My Block. So if you haven't seen On My Block, there's like these 4 kids and they were in like early high school together. And they were all kind of like, they're like little dweebs and they kind of like, they live in the inner city and so they like stay out of trouble. And they come back and one of the 4 of them has joined their older brother's gang or cousin's gang. And so the other 3 keep trying to tell him like, you're not a gangbanger. And the kid's like, yeah, but this is my family and this is like what we do. So he is starting to shift his social identity in a new direction. And when the other friends don't support the social identity, they have trouble spending time together. This is just the facts. I know you would love to live in a world where if I suddenly decide like my perceived valued social identity is that I'm going to be a junkie and I'm going to just do all the heroin. You would love it if you could just look at me and be like, but I know the real you. This is me getting close to the camera. I know the real you. The real you is no junkie. And then I would just be like, you're right. I'm going to go back to the way I wanted it. But that's not the way it works. If I want to change my valued social identity to something else, I have to be the one that values it. You can't just tell me that's what's going to happen. Your only choice, first of all, if you're the person with the valued social identity, you need to think really hard about the valued social identity you're projecting because you're asking people to validate that. So if you don't want to be a vapid, narcissistic, Instagram-obsessed, superficial person, don't project that out there because you will attract the people and like the people who reinforce that identity, right? So you don't put those vibes out there. On the flip side, if you have someone who has a certain valued social identity that you don't necessarily support because in private they're very different, you don't get to make that choice. You're either here for the valued social identity or you're not. And you can certainly set boundaries, right? I don't want to hang out with you when you're acting like this. It's that Avril Lavigne song. You dressed up in all your fancy clothes, that one. So it's all about like how when he's with his friends, he like pretends to be one person. And then when he's with her, he's somebody different. But the thing is that it's the valued social identity that actually makes the more sense. So if you're not validating someone's social identity, your relationship is going to be strained, and that's fine because you don't have to validate someone's social identity just because you're friends. Or you have every right to be like, you know what, we were friends when you had this other valued social identity, and now you're this other person, and I don't really like the new person, so I'm going to stop hanging out with you. That's absolutely fine, but you can't walk around with this expectation that who you want them to be is how they're going to behave. So again, the theory of perceived valued social identity support says that we are going to value the relationships most where people in them reinforce and confirm our valued social identity, whether it is real or whether it is something that we just kind of project into the world. All right. So again, you can argue with the theory, you can say it's not right, but the best predictor of whether relationships, especially friendships, stay committed long term is the degree to which the people in your circle uphold and confirm your valued social identity. And that is everything about the self, all of your domains of self, how your self is made, how self-identity works, the social identity that you project to people and how they pick it up. And that is all stuff that you need to think about, how you're working all of those equations, because all of those things are going to feed into how successful and satisfied you are in your relationships with other people. And that is it for video 2. We got one more, and I will see you in a bit.